Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. Jackie Kay is the current Makar, the Scottish equivalent to the English Poet Laureate, but writes for many different media, and her work is known and acclaimed around the world. Her thrilling memoir, Red Dust Road, was published in 2010, but it is now to be adapted for the stage by Tanika Gupta for a co-production between the National Theatre of Scotland and Home Manchester, which will open at the Edinburgh International Festival in August 2019. I spoke to Jackie in May at Home Manchester, where the production will visit in September 2019, and asked her to explain what her original book was about.
Red Dust Road was originally a book about my quest. In a way, it's a bit of a thriller where I become a bit like a private investigator in my own life, and I find my birth father and my birth mother, and I also write about my parents, Helen and John Kay, that were to me my real parents that brought me up. And the book really becomes, or asks, that pretty essential question, you know, what makes us who we are? Is it genes, or is it a mixture of myth and porridge?
Yeah. It's quite a scary adventure that you end up going on. Like you say, it is an adventure story, and chronologically you're jumping about a lot, but it still seems to build up like an adventure. And some of the adventures that you actually go on when you're going to meet your family, especially later on in the book, some of these journeys are actually quite frightening, aren't they?
Yeah, they were kind of hairy because I travelled right across Nigeria.
Yes. And some quite scary roads.
Yeah, the scary big holes in the road, and at one point the tyre blew, and then we were waiting in the Kashi and me, a really good friend, Kashi Zumbo, who came with me for the whole journey. Yeah. And we waited in the hot sun till we could get a tyre. But that all felt part of. It felt like I wanted to see Nigeria change colour, and my really good friend Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie was trying to kind of persuade me to just fly, but I just really wanted to see Nigeria and to see it change from state to state, from west to east, to see the country from north to south, to see the country take shape before my very eyes. And it felt like I then felt like I was on an odyssey rather than just an ordinary journey. An odyssey because there was such a lot at stake, and because I had this person in my head that I was going to try and meet again for the second time, my birth father. And that was a bit like a Wizard of Oz type journey. And the Red Dust Road, which I called really because of Yellow Brick Road, the Red Dust Road became a road that didn't necessarily lead to where I thought it might lead.
Yeah, it's almost a pilgrimage. You felt like you didn't want to take the easy route. You flew back again, but you were going way out of the usual tourist or the busy city areas into a quite out of the way village, weren't you?
Yeah, exactly. I went to tiny wee village in eastern Nigeria, and it felt really exciting to be there. I remember, when my eyes first saw the Red Dust Road, that I'd had in my imagination since I was a child. It was a bit like, all I had to do was put my bare feet onto the sand, and it was like my footsteps had been waiting for me and knew where to take me. Yeah.
And your four parents, the parents who brought you up, and your two birth parents, you distinguish them as your mum and dad and your mother and father, don't you, in the book? They all reacted in very different ways to this mission of yours, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my birth father's case, he didn't particularly want to be found, and he felt like coming to meet me for the first time, like 7 years earlier, was him doing his duty in front of God, but he didn't want me to be found, and he didn't want to tell his children about me. He said, I have discussed this with God, and God agrees with me. But for the time being, it's best to keep you secret. When he said God agrees with me, it was like he partly confused himself with God. Yes. And I think people that are extremely religious in that way often do. They often mix up their own ego with God's ego.
So they create a God that has the same opinions as themselves.
Exactly, in their own image. Yeah. So it's not the opposite way around, which we are always told that we're made in the likeness of God. It's that human beings create God in the likeness of them. Yeah. And that's a crucial turnaround, and an interesting one. So on the one hand, I had kind of strangers that were my parents who didn't really want to be found, And I think that your life becomes a bit of a detective story when you have parts of yourself, if you like, that you're hunting for. It's like you're a private investigator investigating into your own life. And that becomes a strange journey. And then there's my mum and dad. My mum was very excited by me doing all of this and found it really curious, and I'd always loved that anyway. She always saw her kids as being babies that came with stories attached to them, stories that get handed down rather than genes and blood and illnesses. But my dad didn't really find it so interesting or want to know anything really about his children's original parents. He found that disturbing and disquieting. It upset his notion of family, because for him his family was his kids, and that was that. So I found that really interesting, that everybody had their own different way of reacting to the story.
When you were young, your mum helped you conjure up some stories as well. You had this sort of fantasy notion of your birth parents, didn't you, that you were sort of cracking into as you found out the reality, didn't you?
Yeah, my mum always used to say about my birth father, she'd tell me that my birth mother and father had been in love, but that he'd been betrothed, and that he'd had to go back to Nigeria because he was betrothed. And she kept repeating this word because I think she really loved it. And she loved the drama of the word. So anyway, my mum, being a bit of a drama queen and loving acting, kind of made of her children's stories great soap operas, really. And so our own lives became a little bit of a soap opera to ourselves, which is really, I think, what happens when you're adopted anyway, because you've been separated from an original story and put in a different story altogether, which is immediately fascinating to anybody, really. Just the idea, the randomness of it, the coincidence, how much open to chance and circumstance it is. I mean, all our lives are open to that, but it seems even more so when you're adopted. And then she loved kind of trying to imagine my birth father, and she'd say, I'm picturing a Paul Robeson figure, Jackie, maybe with a bit of Nelson Mandela mixed in. And she'd create this really quite wonderful man, tall, handsome, stately-like, and different times he would be Sidney Poitier. He'd just get to inhabit just about any black man that she might have come across in culture, whether it be Louis Armstrong or Sidney Poitier, or in politics, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King.
But from all of these images, whatever he was like, it'd be hard for him to live up to that image already, wouldn't it, when you finally met him? Yeah,
it would have been. It would have been very hard.
But you also had a brother in the family that you grew up in who was also adopted, and he had different opinions on his birth parents, didn't he, as well?
Yeah, and he had a completely different set of circumstances and different story, which is more his story than mine. And he wasn't so interested in finding out. I think he felt more rejected in a strange way than I did. They didn't want to know anything about me, so why should I want to know anything about them? So that's what he was like, and he had a very, very different story. And also, he didn't really embrace, although he's my colour of skin, and when they first adopted him, there's graffiti went up in Bishop Briggs saying "Wogs go home," which could only have been about him, this wee baby. And they weren't going to even tell my mum and dad that they had a baby. My mum just happened to say, by the way, we don't mind what colour the baby is, and they said, oh really? Well, in that case we have a baby for you. So they were really shocked, and then they got a visit from the local minister saying, we'd like to thank you for this kind act of God. But my brother still didn't actually see himself as being black, and told me that I was making a right arse of myself going around telling people you're black. You're making a right arse of yourself going around telling people you're black. And I said, well, you're making an arse of yourself going around telling people you're white. And he said, I'm not telling people I'm white. And I said, well, what colour are you saying you are then? And he went, fawn.
The rules of adoption have changed so many times over the years, haven't they? Because I was here in January, I think it was, interviewing another writer who'd written of his own experiences of growing up mixed race in a white family in Manchester, and he was saying how the adoption rules had changed. That wouldn't be allowed now, or the different times.
Was that Lem, Sissy? No.
No, it was David Judge, he's called it. He performed his own play called Sparkplug, which is about growing up in the 80s and 90s. He's a lot younger than us.
Yeah.
So that situation that you were in is probably very different now.
It is, it's very, very different, and the whole rules and how it's seen is very different. And for those of us who were adopted in the 60s, transracially adopted, that's like a whole different kind of experience, because in the 60s they didn't even necessarily encourage people to try, adoptive parents that is, to try and give their kids a sense of their original culture. Whereas now people would be either picked to try and mirror the children's original culture, or they would be definitely told to try and give them a real sense of that. And they judged that, having interviewed so many children that came out of 60s transracially adopted experiences, that it was actually psychologically damaging to be transracially adopted. That's what they decided.
Yeah, they make decisions without asking people like you who've been through it whether you feel damaged.
Yeah, exactly.
But you grew up in the 60s and 70s at a time when, I grew up at a similar time. I'm slightly younger than you, but not much, so I remember the 70s and the 80s and the National Front and some of those slogans that you mentioned before, and worse probably. And even so, obviously I was never on the receiving end of any of it. Some of the things that you mention in your book I found quite shocking, like when you were being accosted on, was it a tube station? And some man dressed up in a suit said he didn't, some racist thugs obviously said he didn't intervene because he agreed with them. Now, that's terrible, isn't it, now, looking back? That must have really felt shocking. You put it across very well in your book, of course.
It was really, really shocking to be attacked by, fascist thugs. And I had that a couple of times in the 70s, and it was very distressing. But what was even more distressing was the man that you described, who was stood there in a suit, and when I said to him, "Aren't you going to help us?" he turned around and said, "No, we support them." And there was 3 men all in suits, and they just stood by and watched, and that sort of left, it was probably the most shocking thing that I've ever heard said in my life, much more shocking than being called all the different names, and more shocking even than the guys that broke the bottle and brought the broken bottle up to our face. It was more shocking than all of these things, because it was the idea that in your midst you had somebody who actually could just stand by and do absolutely nothing. And that's very, very chilling. I still find that chilling just to think back on it.
I did reading it, very recently, because the other people, they sort of fulfil the stereotype of a racist thug. But when somebody who looks respectable, he doesn't just agree with their politics, he agrees with them hurting you physically. That's just a bizarre philosophy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the things that makes the book, although the book was published 9 years ago, those kind of sections of it feel very contemporary now, in a weird way, to even more than they did 9 years ago. And that's because the whole business with Brexit, of course, has brought back a sense of people feeling like they can just come out with extremely right-wing things, and the instances of racial attacks in this country in the last 3 years have increased exponentially, and it's a real worry to me that what seemed like, when I was writing those chapters, it seemed like I was putting them safely, in a sense, into the 70s or into the past. And it's really horrifying when the present day brings those times roaring and snarling back into a kind of terrible current dynamic that we're in right now.
How did it come about that this is going to become a play, and what's it been like looking back on something that you said you shut away 9 years ago?
Well, it's the National Theatre Scotland actually got the rights to the book 9 years ago, and so they've had it for quite a long period of time, and different people have been in charge of the National Theatre of Scotland. It was Vicky Featherstone who was first in charge of it when they first got the rights to the book. And I think there's been so many different changes within the National Theatre of Scotland. It's taken them a while to get round to being able to put it on as a play. In the sense, it now feels like the perfect time for it to be on because of some of those things that we were just talking about now, about the divisions that are existing in society. It might be a play that brings things and people together, and that's what you hope for all theatre. That's what you hope for all theatre, to kind of open its wide arms and bring people in and let them discover something new about themselves. So I'd always kind of been expecting that it might happen one day. So now it's about to happen. It's very thrilling. I'm not adapting it myself.
No.
So Tanika Gupta is adapting it, and I think she'll do a great job. I do have a say over the script, so I'll get to see the script and get to chip in, and that'll be fun. But I feel like it was really important to me not to try and adapt it myself, the theatre, even though I do write for the theatre. I thought it was better to be getting on with the new book that I'm writing.
So you thought bringing somebody fresh into it might give it a different perspective, do you think?
Yeah, I think sometimes when you're too close up to something, you don't necessarily choose salient scenes, the parts that need to be brought out. I mean, there's any number of ways that you could adapt Red Dust Road. There's any number of ways you could focus the story. Either your eyes could go to one side of the story or the other. My hope is that the whole story will feel a whole, and I think that Tanika will do that. Yeah,
and that's always the difficulty with adapting a book, because something book size doesn't fit in an evening in the theatre, does it? And there's so much packed into that story. Sometimes that thread disappears when a book's adapted for the stage, doesn't it? Did you have an idea of how you would see it yourself if you were doing it?
I'd like, because when I was writing it, the most important thing to me was that I wasn't just trying to kind of create a voice for myself, because memoir can often be a solitary voice, the voice of the memoirist. And I didn't want it to be like that. I wanted it to be a kind of multi-memoir and to be multiple and multi-voiced. And it seemed really important to me that I captured the kind of syntax and speech rhythms of my dad, who would say to me, "I've no idea why Jackie went all that way to meet that bampot," on the one hand, and my birth father, who'd say, "I've discussed this with God and God agrees with me that for the time being it's best to keep your secret." And I wanted to get those speech rhythms and patterns right. So for me, the most exciting thing will be a great ensemble piece of theatre that brings these characters and voices richly to life with all of their idiosyncratic speech patterns and language and all of their rich, vivid character. Because I suppose you write a memoir when your life feels larger than life, and you write because your life suddenly got very large. It feels very large, and you write probably to try and contain it again to something that's manageable for you, something that you can then digest and make sense of. You
can understand as a narrative, perhaps. Did it bring some sense to it by forming it as a narrative, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely brought some sort of sense, and it definitely helped, because tracing original parents can be traumatic. And you don't know what you're going to find. You don't know. I mean, your parents, when they had to give you up, were probably vulnerable. You're probably going to find people 20, 30 years later that are still vulnerable in different ways, and that are maybe feel differently about having had to give a child up for adoption. That's kind of a really, really hard thing to do. It's a hard thing for anybody to do, to have a part of their lives that they're no longer in touch with in any way, and that they've just got to imagine. So you're on both sides of the imaginary divide, if you like. One's imagining what the other might be like, and the imagination's a very powerful thing. And when you're adopted or split from your parents in any way, through grief or through divorce or through whatever it is that happens to you that makes one story split from another, and you have to then take the other story as being your own, that whole tendency to imagine becomes a force in your life, and you see how powerful the imagination is.
So you're already writing multiple possible storylines before you knock on that door to find out what's going to happen, anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
The book tells us how the various people in your story reacted to your search for them or search for somebody else in the family in some cases. But it doesn't actually tell us how they reacted to their story being published. So what was the reaction from the people who are in the book? Because they were certainly at the moment the book was published, they were all still alive and still able to access the book. So did you get any reaction from them?
Yeah, I mean, from my dad, I let my mum and dad see the book before, and my brother see the book in Glasgow, that is, before it was published. And my dad was reading it and went, "That isn't me, that isn't me, that isn't me. Oh Christ, that is me." And then there's a bit that said that he'd been jealous with me finding my Nigerian father, and he got to this bit in the book and he said, "How would I be jealous when I wasn't jealous when you found your own mother and she's in this country and he's all the way in Nigeria?" And my mum said, "Because it's another father, John." And he said, "Well, can you put in your book, my dad disputes this?" So I did find a way to write that in my book, my dad disputes this. And my brother phoned up and said, "Sister, Pidge, 150, you've got me driving a Yamaha 750, it was a Honda 500 XL." and so it became interesting what was what was important to people. Yeah. And then my birth father, I did send him the book, but he doesn't actually read. He only reads the Bible and books about trees, so he wasn't really interested in reading any of my books. And my birth brothers were happy to be written about as long as I protected them by changing things that would make them too easily identified, like their names. So I just did do that. But with my birth mother, she already had dementia, so wasn't able to read the book.
Yeah. It might be a little bit of a spoiler, but the book ends on a bit of a triumphant, not reunion, but union, doesn't it? I was wondering how that relationship played out after the book, because it went better than you could have expected. It comes across in the book. So has that continued since then? Yeah,
I'm still really in touch with my brothers, and one of them sadly has died since, but the other two I'm still really in touch with, and that's wonderful. It interests me how much people like to know the story of what happened after the story finishes, and that to me, I take that as a huge compliment, really. I mean, I remember being in Glasgow in John Lewis, and this man coming up to me one Christmas quite a few years ago and saying, "Excuse me interrupting you in your private life, but are you Jackie Kay?" And I said yes, and he said, "Well, I loved Red Dust Road, dear. Can you give us a wee chapter every Christmas and tell us how everybody's getting on?" And I really loved the idea that he'd like that. And sometimes I kind of toy with, because there has been such a lot that's happened since. And, when you're adopted, your story is ongoing. It doesn't just stop. There isn't a point at which you say, right, that's it, over and out. It continues, and all sorts of other bizarre things happen, strange things happen. But I haven't written about them yet.
Right, so that's still formulating as a narrative, perhaps?
Perhaps, yeah, I'm not sure.
But you did say before that you're working on a book at the moment. Is that something you're able to talk about?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel called Bystander. And actually, having talked to you about that incident at the Angel with the man who just stood by and didn't do anything, that probably is one of the triggers for writing Bystander. But I'm really interested in whether people are active or passive when they witness things, and this novel connects around a bunch of characters who are all in the same place at the same time when something in particular happens, and it's really all the various different ways that they have of reacting, but it's all of the different ways in which we are, or we do, stand by in our lives, when we bystand, or when we don't really take part, and when we feel ourselves not taking part in our lives in the way that we really, really could, when we feel ourselves sort of partly switching off to things. So it's all about all of these different things.
Right. Lots of people observe things, big things happening in front of them through the screen of the mobile phone.
Exactly. Yeah,
right. But it's just another way of separating yourself, just the modern way of doing it. I suppose people have always done it in some way, haven't they?
Yeah. But I think we do it in our times far, far more now. I think so much so. I mean, when you walk down any street, you see loads of people walking by, not just on their phones, but with earphones in, so the actual noise of the world is shut out to them.
Yeah.
Somebody just stopping and asking somebody a question now of directions, you have to pick somebody that's not that's not all tooled up in one way or another, because so many people go about, whether they're on trains, walking down the street, in the countryside, in their own private worlds. So bird song, the noises of people, the noises of traffic, noises of any natural sound is actually taken away from them, and that's really quite something. We live in such we live in a world that we create ourselves. And it's, you know, from our TV choices to what we watch on Netflix, to what box, you know, even box sets are the thing of the past. You know, so it's just fascinating to me how quickly that's changing and how isolating it's become at the same time as saying that we're all connected.
It
feels like the word connected is now a deeply ironic word that you have to sort of go into the corner of a room and ho 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 to, you know, the very idea of being connected.
No, it's fascinating. Very, very current idea. This the Red Dust Road, it's been premiered for the Edinburgh International Festival, which is a big thing, and it's coming here to home in Manchester. Those are two cities that have been quite important to you in your life. What does it mean to you to have your life being put on stage in those two places?
It feels like, in an odd way, I've come home. Because I was born in Edinburgh. I was born in Elsie Ingalls Hospital in Edinburgh. My birth mother went to a mother and baby home there. The idea that it should be on in the Lyceum is totally wonderful. And then the idea that it should come home here to home is also wonderful, because I live in Manchester a lot of my time, and I love this big urban living room that is home. I always feel perfectly at home here, whether I come to see the theatre on my own or come to see an exhibition or a film. I'm here a lot, and it's home from home. And I think that theatre, when it really makes an impact on you, it has that ability to make you feel home from home, to make you feel that you're so involved and so enraptured in an experience, that it's your experience that's happening to you. And, you know, theatre at its most powerful is when you're completely and utterly involved. You're not just really a watcher anymore, you're not an observer, you're an actor, you're a participant, you're part of the story. And so for me, it being on in Edinburgh and it being on at home, and in Stirling, where I went to university, and in Inverness, where is the nearest town to where my birth mother was born, in Nairn, it feels like every place on the journey of Red Dust Road's tour is a place in the journey of my life.
And what do you think it's going to feel like to you to be sat in an auditorium watching somebody else as you acting out things that you've lived?
It might be discomforting, it might be cringe making, it might also be liberating, because while somebody's playing me, I might get a chance to be somebody else. I'm hoping for that. But it's bound to be, I'm bound to have that experience a bit like my dad, where I'll go, that isn't me, oh Christ, that is me. It will probably be like that, because there's bound to be, but in a sense I don't really mind how authentic to me the character feels. Because you'd have to know me to know whether that was authentic or not. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that it feels like really powerful theatre, and that it keeps the spirit of my book somehow, and keeps those multiple voices. I mean, my mum keeps saying, who's going to be playing me? and she and my dad might have more trouble with the idea of wanting the character to be exactly like them. I don't need the character to be exactly like me. In fact, I know it would be impossible for them to find somebody exactly like me, because I'm a bit of a one-off, and it's also quite hard to find a mixed race Scottish actress of my age that would kind of inhabit me.
You're a bit of a niche.
easily. Well, I'm a niche mark itself. Yeah, probably. I'm a bit of a niche. But so it'll be interesting. It'll be fascinating to see who they get to be me. And they'll have to have several me's, because it goes over a course of time. So they'll have a younger version and an older version, and maybe a middle version of me.
Yeah. So what else? I'm assuming you've got other things on apart from this and the novel, because you work in so many different media, don't you? Novel, poetry, theatre, and I don't think there's been a year when I've been to Edinburgh where you've not been doing something there, usually at the book festival. So what else have you got coming up at the moment?
Well, because I'm the National Poet of Scotland, I'm writing a poem for the 20-year anniversary of the Scottish Parliament, so I'm doing that, and that'll be really, exciting. It's exciting to do. I've got a number of different pieces that I'm writing for one place and another. I'm Chancellor of Salford University, so I've got my graduations coming up in July, which will be an amazing thing. I'm about to go to Uganda on Monday for the African Women's Writers Conference, where I'm a guest of honour, and I'm going to Rome, where they've just published a book of mine, and I'm judging an Italian Children's Writers' Prize. I'm just judging the Young People's Poetry Prize at Foyles. I'm going to be presenting the Society of Author Awards this year in June, and I've just picked a number of different writers, 10 different writers, BAME writers, to be showcased by the British Council to increase their profile in writing abroad. So I'll be going around and introducing them, doing an event at Manchester Literature Festival with the American Poet Laureate, and I'm really interested in connecting poetry in the way that poetry makes a map of the world, and so I've got lots of different poetry projects on at the moment to create a kind of Makar's map of Scotland.
So what do you think young Jackie Kay, growing up in Glasgow, would have thought if you'd have told her that in 2019, 2020 you'd be doing all of those things?
She'd have probably I don't know what she'd have thought. Yeah, she'd have.
It's an impressive list, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I don't know what she'd have thought. I think she'd have still found that there was something else that she wanted me to do, because she was quite busy then as well.
Yeah.
So I was always kind of had loads of things on the go and lots of different interests. I used to play hockey, play netball. I was a Scottish Girl Championship runner, and I liked writing and I liked acting when I was young, and I was also really politically involved and an activist in lots of ways. So I think I probably kept a lot of these component parts of my life that I had when I was 14 and just adapted them. I'm probably a bit more sedentary now. She'd tell me to she'd tell me to pick up a sport again as well, probably.
Jackie Kay's book Red Dust Road is published by Picador. The stage adaptation from the National Theatre of Scotland and Home Manchester is adapted by Tanika Gupta and directed by Dawn Walton. The production will open at Edinburgh's Royal Lyceum Theatre as part of the Edinburgh International Festival from the 14th to the 18th of August 2019, before touring to Macrobert Arts Centre in Stirling, Eden Court Theatre in Inverness, and finishing at Home Manchester from the 11th to the 21st of September. For more information, see www.nationaltheatrescotland.com, the Edinburgh International Festival website www.eif.co.uk, or Home Manchester's website homemcr.org. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.